Hi, I'm Dave Pearson with the National Tactical Officers Association. I'm the current Less Lethal Section Chair. I'm also the main instructor for our Less Lethal Instructor Program. In almost every class that I'm in, the topic of suicidal subjects comes up. And we have such a swing around the country of people that think we should go and help suicidal subjects out and never leave the scene no matter what. And those that say, why even go? Because we're going to get ourselves in trouble and there's no reason in shooting somebody that is trying to commit suicide in a way of helping them out, in essence. And when I talk to people, I always go back to the concepts. And these concepts are some of the concepts I cover in the top 20 class. But it really helps us understand whether or not we should actually go and help a suicidal subject. The first concept I want to talk about are the safety priorities. As we know, the safety priorities are the priorities of life. We use safety priorities now as hostages, innocent civilians, officers, and the subject or suspect. Since we're talking about suicidal subjects, we're going to just use the term subject. Now, in almost all these cases, there are no hostages involved, so we can mark that off our list. But as we look down, we'll have officers that say, well, we shouldn't go because we're above them on the priority list, so we should never go help a suicidal subject out. And my response is, I disagree. If you notice, they are on the list. And I think if you really cherish life and you're really interested in helping somebody out, why wouldn't we go on a suicidal call? I mean, aren't we there to help them out? And then if we don't go, who is going to go and help us? Now, there's a lot of programs out there. One is the CIT program, and the other is kind of a licensed mental health professional co-responder program where we can take them out on the street with us and help us out. But I always caution people not to try to use a tool so much that they violate tactical principles to do it. These are very good programs, but I want to do them safely. So the safety priorities would dictate, in my mind, that we go and help somebody out. But the safety priorities also dictate how we're going to handle that call. This tells us that we shouldn't walk up and try to take the gun out of somebody's hand or the knife out of somebody's hand. And we just can't shoot them with deadly force. I mean, who would want to do that unless they obviously create some sort of lethal threat? But in most cases, they don't. And so it doesn't make sense to shoot them with a lethal round when we're really trying to help them out. And that's the big thing about less lethal. The philosophy of less lethal is it bridges the gap between standard force, hands, baton, and OC, and deadly force. And so in that middle area there, we have to have an ability to try to help these people out, and that's what less lethal is for. And we'll get to that in a little bit. So the safety priorities would dictate that we do help suicidal subjects out because they're on the list, but it also would dictate that we don't do noble cause mentality and try to do something that's unsafe. The next thing we talk about is use of force. Understanding use of force in this is extremely important. The main case that we look at is Graham v. Connor. Now, Graham v. Connor has the three-pronged test. And that talks about the severity of the crime. It talks about the immediate threat that the suspect is presenting. And it also talks about their attempts to either resist arrest or evade arrest through some sort of use of weapon. And so those prongs are already tied up in Graham v. Connor. But there's a back half of Graham v. Connor, and that talks about the balance. And this balance is about the governmental interest versus a person's right to protection against some sort of use of force or a seizure, if that makes sense, because the use of force is a seizure. Now, since we don't have a crime, we kind of take this part of Graham v. Connor out, but this is a very important piece, and understanding this balance is very important. The next thing we talk about is the law. And what I mean by the law is where somebody's located makes a difference. The three places that we're likely to contact somebody that's suicidal is either in open air, in a vehicle, or in their home. And let's take each one of these and we'll work through that. The expectation of privacy isn't there for open air, and so our ability to impact somebody. When I talk about impacting somebody, I'm talking about going up and talking to them, trying to get them to drop their weapon, potentially using some level of force. Now, it's not about being able to use force. I'm not talking about trying to articulate some method so we can use force all the time, but if we're truly there to save their life, sometimes we actually have to use some level of force to do it. And again, less lethal is usually going to fall in there because we can't just shoot them, nor should we, and we don't want to walk up and just use our hands to take the gun out of their hands. So the expectation of privacy in an open air environment is very little. So our ability to use force, and again, you always want to talk to the person. You always want to use good soft skills. We always want to try to communicate and get some level of cooperation. And if we can get that level of cooperation without ever touching them, that's a great win for us. So whenever I'm talking through this, always assume that we are trying to use good soft skills and we are trying to gain cooperation through good verbal communication, if that makes sense. So we have a person out in the open air, and as we talked about, there's no expectation of privacy. But let's say for the purposes of this, they have a gun in their hand. Our ability to impact this person in an open air environment, and let's just pick a park in your jurisdiction. When and how do we want to do this? Well, some people aren't sure, but we tie this back to the governmental interest that comes right back to the safety priorities. A person in an open air environment in the middle of your jurisdiction in a park now creates some sort of jeopardy or some sort of threat to the average individual that's in your community. So our governmental interest in this particular matter is fairly high. We have a person with a gun inside of a park in your jurisdiction, and we have people that are around, because we can't always say, well, I can completely make sure that nobody's going to be around. So our governmental interest is high, and therefore the balance swings in the favor of us being able to impact this person with some use of force a lot sooner than later. You take this same person and put them at the end of some county road where it took you 45 minutes to get there, and there's no other soul around within 5,000 square miles. Now what's your governmental interest? I would submit to you that it's dropped greatly. There's not a lot of innocent civilians out there, and the only other people out there are officers. You might pack up and leave this suicidal person in an open air environment because we don't have a governmental interest to worry about anymore. The difference between somebody in the park and somebody at the each end of this county road is this governmental interest conversation. Since there's no interest or no individuals there, innocent civilians I should say, the only other people that are in jeopardy are officers, so the best way to take care of this problem is then to leave. You made an effort, which was a valiant effort, but it didn't work. They didn't want to drop the gun, so I would leave. Let's move on to a vehicle. Once again, your expectation of privacy in a vehicle isn't there as much because you're out in the public, and therefore your ability to impact this person is really based on the governmental interest. You park that at a Walmart parking lot in the middle of your jurisdiction, and I'm going to tell you your governmental interest is fairly high to protect the innocent civilians from getting involved in that. You also have your officers there, so your ability to impact somebody in that Walmart parking lot is much greater now because of the governmental interest. Take this same vehicle and park it at the end of some county road, again, that took you 45 minutes to get there, and you had to look 4 times on a map to find it, and the fact that nobody else is around. What happens to your governmental interest? I'm going to submit to you that governmental interest now drops, and this person's protection against unreasonable search and seizure now is outweighing that. So you might pack up and leave. The last place that you're probably going to locate somebody is in their home. And this is a very contentious issue for some people. The the Supreme Court has said there's 3 ways to get inside of a house. And that's going to be through a search warrant, consent, and exigent circumstances. I've had some people throw in hot pursuit, but that's not applicable in this particular instance. So in most jurisdictions, we know, actually in every state in this country, there are no laws against private violence. And so what that means is your ability to get PC for a warrant is not there. So you're going to have to scratch search warrant off. The next thing we talk about is consent. The person's inside of their house, they want to kill themselves. It's very unlikely that they're going to invite you now into their home. So we can scratch off consent. The last thing that we have as a way to get into the house is exigent circumstances. Now, there are a lot of people that want to say, well, the person is thinking about committing suicide, that's exigent in and of itself, and I'm going to submit to you, I don't think it is. If you look through the window after hearing a gunshot and you see somebody laying in a pool of blood, I think you now have medical exigent circumstances to get inside the house. Short of that, just the mere threat of killing yourself, I don't think rises to exigent circumstances. But that's up for you to decide with your legal people and their advice. So now we have no ability to get inside the home. But let's say the sister shows up. And she shows up and says, hey, my brother's inside. I know he's suicidal. We'll call him Billy. And this is Margaret. And Margaret says, Billy's going to be in there. And if you don't go in and get him, I'm going to go in myself and get him. Now, for many of us, that's a heartstring tug where you don't want to put that civilian in that position. So she says, I'm giving you permission to go inside the house. Well, the next question you have to ask is what? And we're all saying it to ourselves, does she have legal standing? Absent legal standing, she can't give us permission to go inside the house. And as much as we don't like it, we can't go inside of the house without some sort of either consent, search warrant, or exigent circumstances. So our hands are tied. Even though she's telling you she's going to go inside, you don't have an ability to do it. Now let's take the sister out of that. You show up, you're at a house, you know you can't make entry because you don't have a legal justification to do that. You might have to pack up and leave. Nobody likes that because we're there to help save that person's life. But until you can find a way to get across that threshold, you're kind of screwed, for the lack of a better term. If you break entry into that home, anything after that, that legal transaction starts when you broke through that door without a legal ability, and that starts down the road of really bad stuff. If you can actually get into the door legally, she has standing, or something else happened. Maybe they menaced people and now you have a search warrant. So they menaced somebody before they held up in their house. Now that at least gives you the right to break entry into the house. And I'm not talking about kicking the door and running through the house with their hair on fire to find a suicidal guy. Safety priorities would dictate we not do that. We might use chemical agents or some other tools to get the person out. But until we have an ability to step across that threshold, we're kind of screwed. So let's work again. Should we go help that person? Safety priorities would dictate, yes, we do. But the safety priorities would also dictate that we don't walk up and try to take the gun out of somebody's hand. We understand use of force. Since there's no crime, the first three prongs of Graham v. Connor are kind of thrown out, but we start talking about that balance, the balance of the governmental interest versus their protection for illegal search and seizure. And then we start looking at the law. Are they in open air, a vehicle, or in their own home? Are they in the middle of our jurisdiction in a park or a parking lot in the middle of our jurisdiction? Or are they way at the end to someplace where nobody else is at? You tie that stuff back into this governmental interest, which ties right back into the safety priorities, and then you start to see how you use these concepts to balance how you would interact with somebody that's threatening suicide. Now, the actual tactics and the tools are a completely different class. But if you stand on the safety priorities and understand this balance, you can handle a suicidal call just by understanding these concepts. And that's kind of how I attack that problem.